Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. Today we are going to go through Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's book, Edward S. Herman. It's After the Cataclysm. The title of the book is actually, been, forged. The U.S. government has gone through these books and forged the actual title. The actual title is After the Cataclysm, Post-War Indochina and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology. It's the Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2. It's very unique that a cover doesn't have the actual title of the book, and that's because the U.S. government has gone through its graphic efforts to hide these books because they are, mafia, warmonger, war criminals. I mean, they don't accept their mass murder campaign in Indochina. And, this book actually discusses not only the press fabrications, the capitalist corporate press frauds that, back the U.S. government's vicious murder campaign against the Indochinese people, but it also talks about the automated murder machine of Westmoreland and its, murder campaign against the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodian people. They used all sorts of weapons. They used, cluster bombs that just deploy and then release daughter bombs that go around and, are unexploded. That was one aspect. They use hordes and hordes of napalm. Napalm is a burning agent of the skin. It is, prohibited by international law, international norms. All of these weapons that were used in Indochina were prohibited. They were illegal acts of war by the United States of America. They should have been hanged. What we said was Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger, Dean Rusk, and Robert McNamara. They should have been hanged the way the Nazis were hanged in the tribunal, the Nuremberg tribunal. They broke all of the Nuremberg laws, and they should have been hanged. But the U.S. government, because it is a mafia criminal group of gangster murderers, let them walk free. But we also talk about white phosphorus. This is an element that they used in caves to chase the Laotian people into the caves. They were fighting the Pathet Lao to try to institute a right-wing military dictatorship. And, the Pathet Lao were the local peasant population that had to team with the North Vietnamese Viet Minh to, fend off the racist murders of the U.S. government. And they also used vomiting gases. Poison gases were used by the racist American government. This is a war that the U.S. government wants to hide because they committed so many war crimes, just open acts of rebellion against the Nuremberg laws. These are white savages that, destroyed the fabric of Indochina. They destroyed the society by, just a murder machine and a poison gas machine for which they need to go to, the Hague for imprisonment, or they need to be hanged. The U.S. government need to have hanged these, Nazi-type war criminals for war, criminality. So those are the basic aspects of it. We're going to go through also the press fabrications that led to the story, the partiality of the U.S. Western media. It also includes the Western media. Let's not, just attack the U.S. mass media. That's, of course, completely, completely fraudulent, like a mafia journalism. But the Western media is equally complicit in covering up and, pro-American garbage. So, we have to know that for the future, when you understand the U.S. media, just forget about them. The Western media, just forget about them. They are a propagandist group of liar, fraud, racists. They do not tell anything truthful. They should be, thrown out of the books of journalism. All of the, the central operating Western outlets should be thrown out of the books. You can, know that if you're following them, you are wasting your time. The only way to find out about what the U.S. government does is you can't find out while they're conducting the war. That is the fact. You cannot find out while they're conducting wars because they're liar propagandists. But you can find out 20 years later when scholars write about it and review it. And then the U.S. government goes back and, hides the books. They try to, subvert democracy and push the books away. These are fascist colonial butchers. It is a group of butchers, racist mafia, criminal warmonger, war criminals. So I'm going to get started with some background. Please download the Google Drive link Please download the book. It's going to be available at the Google Drive link. I have the Google Drive link in the description section. I've always put my books in the description section so that you can download it. It's, the full PDF of the book. So please, access the PDF of the book, and you will get the appropriate sources. I recommend reading the book because I do make some changes in the book, like small changes in the prose for clarity. But for the most part, what I say is what's in the book. But I would read the book because these books are invaluable to understand the warmonger American government. So we will be discussing the U.S. government warmonger war criminals in the book, post-war Indochina and the Reconstruction of the Imperial Ideology, Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2. The United States government's actions in Indochina speak of unspeakable brutality, mass slaughter, the use of prohibited warfare technology, including white phosphorus, vomiting gases, mustard gases, and cluster bombs. Those bombs of cluster bombs release daughter bombs, which remain in the land far after the United States had withdrawn. In Dr. Chomsky's mind, the United States' action in Indochina was a criminal war of aggression by a superpower which unleashed unspeakable brutality and a military machine on a defenseless peasant population in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. He discusses at length the war criminal Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, Dwight Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, John Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and Henry Kissinger, all of whom were responsible for the mass murder and genocide of the U.S. government from the years 1954 to 1975. Our first discussion is the U.S. impact in Indochina. The press fraud whites of the United States mass media, including the New York Times, James Reston, and Henry Kamm, Pulitzer Prize-winning white frauds, Washington Post, Newsweek, and Reader's Digest, among many others who fabricated both the extent of United States devastation of the land, claiming that the U.S. had been very cautious when it came to bombing the Indochinese people. Those fabrications were followed by an attack on the Communist Party of Vietnam, who were trying to rebuild their land that had been devastated by the savagery of United States government automated murder machine of General Westmoreland. The U.S. warmongers were chasing oil in Indochina, and the history of Indochina includes plantation slavery by the racist whites of the French colonial government rule, who had kept the Indochinese people as plantation slaves from the 1870s to 1946. Upon the completion of World War II, the French racist enslavers tried to retake Indochina and fought a war with the Indochinese, who had proclaimed independence. The U.S. warmongers, after the French defeat in Indochina, had offered France nuclear weapons, as John Foster Dulles told Premier Lanier, for unleashing devastation on Dien Bien Phu. This nuclear threat also included threats of nuclear attack on the Chinese mainland if China entered the war. It did not materialize, and the French lost the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and were ultimately defeated in Indochina. The United States warmongers could not accept the independence and sovereignty of Ho Chi Minh and his people, who had made gestures to President Wilson, a racist Ku Klux Klan and savage white American murderer, as well as Franklin Roosevelt, who both refused the gestures and did not assist the Indochinese people in their independence goals. Ultimately, the United States destroyed the international agreements, as the American warmonger mafia war criminals always do, and they threw out the Geneva Accords, the Paris Agreements, and even the Nuremberg trials, and waged a savage and brutal war against the Asians in Indochina. The U.S. government capitalist white frauds were trying to re-enslave the Indochinese people and take away their natural resources and steal the money of the native indigenous Indochinese. The U.S. oil-hungry mafia mass murders broke all international laws in this war and were condemned by the United Nations, the Geneva Accords, the Parisian elite, and the political French government, and numerous other countries. It is typical for the American government to flout international laws in its colonial enslavement of the Asian peoples, as they did in Indonesia, China, and Indochina. They enslaved the Chinese with a brutal dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek, who murdered over 1 million Chinese for American capitalism. He was a gangster and was proudly supported by Presidents Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower. The war was a racist war, as Chomsky states in his book. The Americans had racist tropes of Asian savages and criminal Asians who were low IQ and lazy and incapable of self-government due to their childlike attitudes for the Indochinese. The U.S. government's murderous mafia gangsters hide their history and flout international norms for the sake of racist European prestige that they show the world due to all sorts of racist Oscar awards that they get for their murder campaigns across the world. So let's get started. I'm just gonna read for 2 straight hours and then I'll be done. So we'll be reading for 2 straight hours and then we'll be done. U.S. impact on Indochina. The U.S. war on Indochina began as one of innumerable examples of counter-revolutionary intervention throughout the world as a result of the wholly unanticipated level of resistance of the Vietnamese revolutionaries and later their allies when the United States spread the war to the rest of Indochina. It was gradually transformed into one of the most destructive and murderous attacks on a civilian population in history as the world's most powerful military machine was unleashed against peasant societies with extremely limited means of self-defense and lacking the capacity to strike back at the source of aggression. The main outlines of the U.S. war are well documented. After World War II, the United States determined to back French imperialism in its efforts to destroy what planners clearly recognized to be an indigenous nationalist movement in Vietnam, which declared independence in 1945 and vainly sought recognition and aid from the United States. The French-U.S. repacification effort failed. In 1954, France accepted a political settlement at Geneva, which, if adhered to by the United States, would have led to independence for the 3 countries of Indochina. Unwilling to accept the terms of this settlement, the United States undertook at once to subvert them. A client regime was established in South Vietnam, which immediately respected the basic framework of the agreement, launched a fierce repression in the South, and refused to permit the elections to unify the 2 administrative zones of the country as laid down in the Geneva Accords. See Volume 1, Chapter 3. In the 1950s, the United States still hoped to be able to reconquer all of Vietnam. Later, it limited its aims to maintaining control over South Vietnam and incorporating it into the free world by any necessary means. Direct involvement of the U.S. armed forces and in military action against the South Vietnamese began in 1961 to 1962. Meanwhile, in Laos, the United States also successfully undermined the Geneva political settlement and prevented any sharing of power. The Pathet Lao, the left-wing resistance forces that had fought the French and won the 1958 election despite a major U.S. effort to prevent this outcome. The United States then turned to subversion and fraud, setting off a civil war in which, as in South Vietnam, the right-wing military backed by the United States, was unable to hold its own. Meanwhile, Cambodia was able to maintain independence despite continual harassment by U.S. clients in Thailand and South Vietnam and an unsuccessful effort at subversion in the late 1950s. By the early 1960s, virtually all parties concerned, apart from the United States and its various local clients, were making serious efforts to avoid an impending war by neutralizing South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. That is, removing them from external, overwhelmingly U.S. influence and control. Such an outcome was an anathema to the U.S. leadership. President Johnson informed Ambassador Lodge in 1964 that his mission was knocking down the idea of neutralization wherever it rears its ugly head. The United States was deeply concerned to prevent any negotiated political settlement because, as it is easily documented, its planners and leaders assumed that the groups that they backed could not possibly survive peaceful competition. Once again, the United States succeeded in preventing a peaceful settlement. In South Vietnam, it stood in opposition to all significant political forces. However, anti-communist imposing the rule of a military clique that was willing to serve U.S. interests. By January 1965, the United States was compelled to undermine its own puppet. General Khan, he was attempting to form what Ambassador Taylor called a dangerous coalition with the Buddhists who were not acting in the interests of the nation, as General Westmoreland explained. What is more, Khan was apparently trying to make peace with the NLF, quite possibly a factor that lay behind the elimination of his predecessors. At that point, the United States, which stood alone in understanding the interests of the nation, quote unquote, in South Vietnam, had no alternative but to extend its already substantial military campaign against the rural society of the South, where the overwhelming majority of the population lived. The United States therefore launched a full-scale invasion in a final effort to destroy the organized popular forces in the South. The invasion was accompanied by the bombing of North Vietnam, undertaken to lay some basis for the claim that the United States was, quote, defending the South against external aggression, and in the hope that the DRV would use its influence to bring the Southern Rebellion to a halt and permit the United States to attain its goals. This maneuver failed. The DRV responded by sending limited forces to the South, as most U.S. planners had anticipated. Meanwhile, the United States began the systematic bombing of South Vietnam at 3 times the level of the more publicized and more protested bombing of the North. The war was also intensified in Laos. With U.S. bombing from 1964 and military operations by a clandestine army, quote unquote, of Hmong tribesmen organized and directed by the CIA to supplement the inept official army trained and armed by the U.S. military. U.S. outposts in northern Laos were guiding the bombing of North Vietnam from Thai bases. By this time, Thai and North Vietnamese forces were also engaged, though on a considerably smaller scale. By 1968, the United States was conducting a bombing campaign of extraordinary severity in northern Laos, far removed from the war in South Vietnam. By 1969, the sporadic U.S. Saigon attacks on Cambodia had escalated to intensive bombardment, and after the coup of March 1970, which overthrew the Sihanouk government, Cambodia too was plunged into the inferno. U.S. Saigon military actions began 2 days after the coup, and a full-scale invasion called a limited incursion, quote unquote, took place at the end of April. Limited, quote unquote, as it turned out, largely because of the unprecedented demonstration of protest in the United States. The invasion and the subsequent bombing, particularly in 1973, led to vast suffering and destruction throughout the country. All of these efforts failed. In January 1973, the United States racist warmongers signed a peace treaty in Paris, which virtually recapitulated the NLF program of the early 1960s. This was interpreted as a stunning diplomatic victory in the United States. The United States government announced at once that it would disregard every essential provision of this treaty and proceeded to do so, attempting again to conquer South Vietnam, now through the medium of the vastly expanded military forces it organized, trained, advised, and supplied. In a most remarkable display of servility, the free press misrepresented the new agreement in accordance with the Kissinger-Nixon version, which was diametrically opposed to the text on every crucial point, thus failing to bring out the significance of the U.S. through subversion of the major elements of the agreement. This misrepresentation of the actual terms of the agreement set the stage for indignation at the North Vietnamese response and the sudden collapse of the puppet regime. All of the U.S. efforts dating back to the 1940s eventually failed. By 1975, U.S. clients had been defeated in all parts of Indochina, leaving incredible carnage, bitterness, and near insoluble problems of Reconstruction. The United States thereafter refused reparations or aid and exerted its considerable influence to block assistance from elsewhere. Even trade is blocked by the United States in a striking display of malice. Historical comparisons are only of limited value. Too many factors vary from case to case, but it nevertheless may be suggestive to compare the situation in Indochina after 1975 with that of Western Europe in World War II as World War II came to an end. Western Europe was, of course, a group of advanced industrial countries which had furthermore suffered much less damage than the peasant societies brutalized by the United States in Indochina. Nevertheless, substantial U.S. assistance was provided to reconstruct industrial capitalism and to tame the labor movement and the popular resistance forces. The harsh winters of the early post-war years brought Great Britain almost to its knees, and years went by before the effects of the war in Western Europe were overcome. The early years were marked by brutal massacres, forced labor, and re-education, quote unquote, of prisoners of war and other measures of retribution. In Indochina, the problems of Reconstruction after 1975 were incomparably more severe. The destruction of the land and the social structure far surpassed anything in the industrial democracy subjected to Nazi attack and occupation. There are still no reparations or aid forces for the United States mafia, and only very limited assistance from elsewhere. The most severe natural catastrophe in many decades have caused further havoc, as have conflicts of an extremely serious nature between Vietnam and Cambodia, and Vietnam and China. These conflicts the United States regards with satisfaction, as General Secretary of Defense Harold Brown explained in an address to the Trilateral Commission, composed of elite groups in the United States, Japan, and Western Europe. The Cambodia-Vietnam conflict, quote, does take the pressure off ASEAN, the U.S. Southeast Asian allies, while in the long run, the Vietnamese attempts at minor league hegemonism is likely to preoccupy the communist powers in Southeast Asia for some time to come. The conflicts are also helpful to U.S. policy by further impeding the difficult tasks of reconstruction and creating still more destruction in the lands ravaged by the U.S. military machine. Vast social changes and imperatives in Indochina to overcome centuries of injustice and oppression, exacerbated by French colonialism with its brutal and destructive impact on the peasant society, little recognized or appreciated in the West. Still more urgent, even a matter of sheer survival, is the need to return to the countryside, the millions of people driven into urban concentrations by U.S. violence. The artificial Western implantations which survived on a foreign dole must be dismantled and quickly if the population is to survive. On this matter, all competent authorities agree. It is difficult to imagine how the task might be accomplished without considerable further suffering and disruption under the best circumstances. Certainly the far wealthier Western societies, which had suffered much less from World War II, would have had great difficulty in dealing with their far more limited problems without enormous foreign assistance, and would no doubt have been compelled to resort to draconian measures. It is worth noting that despite their enormous wealth and advantage, the Western powers have never conceived of undertaking serious programs directed to the welfare of the impoverished majority in the underdeveloped countries under their domination and influence, and would have no idea how to proceed, even if, in some stunning reversal of history, they were to devote themselves to these ends. While Western elites are always keen to denounce injustice beyond their reach from their position of privilege that derived from centuries of brutal exploitation, the task of overcoming degradation and poverty within their own realms merits nothing more than occasional rhetorical flights, and they have demonstrated their talents and concern primarily in devising new forms of brutality and oppression when their own interests are threatened. Under existing conditions, it is not clear that the tasks facing the post-war regimes in Indochina can be accomplished at all. By standards of Western European or U.S. history, one should expect brutality, oppression, and recurrent warfare as these problems are confronted. While the countries of Indochina face their perhaps insuperable task, the United States and its allies have tasks as well. One is to reconstruct recent history so as to present their past role in a better light. A second is to ensure that the countries that have freed themselves from Western dominion face harsh and severe conditions. The reasons are primarily two: to teach the lesson that exit from the free world in the interest of national autonomy is the worst fate that a subject people can endure, and to provide a post hoc justification for U.S. intervention by showing the awful consequences of its defeat. It is obvious that the most severe consequences have followed directly from the original U.S. intervention. It is beyond question that Indochina would be a far happier place if the United States had refrained from backing the French imperial conquest or had been willing to accept the political settlement of 1954, the neutralization proposals advanced by everyone from de Gaulle to the NLF in 1962 to 1964, or the Paris Accords of 1973. It is both irrational and deeply immoral for the propaganda systems of the West to pretend that Western sensibilities are shocked by post-war atrocities and suffering, a transparent effort to efface its own record of barbarism, primarily, though not solely, that of the leader of the free world. But total irrationality has never offered much of an impediment to propagandists in the West in the past, and as we shall see, it is no more of a problem in the present case. As usual, a fair degree of fabrication and deceit also comes in handy. Given the monolithic character of the media and scholarship, which tolerate little dissent, these efforts have achieved extraordinary success. We will now turn to a more detailed discussion of some particular aspects of this amazing story, and we will see how these various themes run their predictable course in connection with each of the countries of Indochina, observing how the West is proceeding to come to terms with its crimes. In the course of this discussion, we will also consider some relevant background. The United States victory in Vietnam, a partial victory. The war in Vietnam ended with a defeat for U.S. imperial violence, but it only ended in a partial defeat, a significant fact. The U.S. Expeditionary Force of over 500,000 men in South Vietnam became a drugged, mutinous, and demoralized rabble and was withdrawn. U.S. leaders had painfully learned a lesson familiar to their predecessors. A conscript army is ill-suited to fight a colonial war with its inevitable barbarism and incessant atrocities against helpless civilians. Such a war is better left to hired killers, such as the French Foreign League, our native mercenaries, or in the modern period to an advanced technology that leaves some psychic distance between the murderers and their victims, although even B-52 pilots reportedly began to object when Nixon and Kissinger dispatched them to devastate Hanoi in December 1972 in a final effort to compel the North Vietnamese to accept a U.S.-dictated peace. The United States was never able to construct a viable Quisling government to organize local forces capable of maintaining the U.S. creation against its Vietnamese enemies. As Richard West remarks, when the communists launched their attacks in March 1975, they were still outnumbered by more than 3-to-1 in manpower and still more in equipment, in spite of the claims that the contrary issued from Saigon. But, quote, the South, that is, the U.S. client regime and its supporters, had simply lost the will to go on fighting. Historian Joseph Budinger comments that its swift and dramatic collapse was not the result of an overwhelming attack by superior military forces and came about because of the degree of moral disintegration the South Vietnamese army had reached in 1975, which in turn reflected the degree of moral and political decay to which South Vietnamese society had sunk years after years of increasing political terror, mass misery, and corruption. That is, after years of U.S. quote-unquote nation-building efforts. As seen by T.D. Allman, one of the most outstanding of the war correspondents, for many years, the U.S. policy of refugee generation created what Senator Fulbright called a society of prostitutes and mercenaries, and the caricature of civilization produced in South Vietnam by the American way of war is what now accounts for the collapse of a state that never had any economic, political, or social basis except that provided by the Americans. The South Vietnamese soldiers fleeing an enemy which had not yet attacked and trying to push their motorbikes onto U.S. ships sums up the products of American nation building. A militant society with nothing worth fighting for, a consumer society that produces nothing, a nation of abandoned women conditioned to flee to the next handout of U.S. surplus rice, of dispossessed gangs hitching rides on U.S. planes to the next jerry-built urban slum. The speed and character of the collapse of the Saigon regime came as a surprise, even to the usually well-informed leadership in Hanoi, and even more so to Washington, where it had been optimistically proclaimed not long before that the regime that the United States continued to support in violation of the scrap of paper signed in Paris in January 1973 was successfully eliminating the parallel and equivalent authority in the South, the PRG, with which it was pledged to accommodate and would be able to understand any military response to its program of undermining the Paris Accords by force and violence. But the U.S. defeat was only partial. To understand events in the post-war Vietnam, it is important to recognize that the United States did in effect win the war in the South. It did not quite succeed in realizing the grim prediction of Bernard Fall that Vietnam as a cultural and historic entity is threatened with extinction as the countryside literally dies under the blows of the largest military machine ever unleashed on an area of this size. But it came close, as the full power of the U.S. Expeditionary Force was let loose against the South in the following years. There was substantial success in, quote, grinding the enemy down by sheer weight and mass, in the accurate words of pacification chief Robert Blowtorch Comer. The southern-based indigenous resistance, which had called for the independence and neutrality of South Vietnam at a time when the U.S. client regime and its sponsor firmly rejected any such outcome, was virtually destroyed, as was the peasant society which it had taken hold. Hence, both the military and political phases of the struggle fell under the control of North Vietnam, viciously attacked with a large part of its above-ground physical structures destroyed, but never crushed as a viable society. Frank Snapp, one of the top CIA analysts of Vietnamese affairs in the later years of the war, writes, at the time the communist victory, the party apparatus in the South was in shambles, thanks in part to the depredations of the Phoenix program. The North Vietnamese army thus remained the primary instrument of control. This consequence of the U.S. war provided a propaganda victory for Western hypocrites who could now maintain on the basis of the direct result of the U.S. assault that the United States was obviously now defending South Vietnam from aggression from Hanoi. The propaganda institutions have, needless to say, lost no time in exploiting their advantage. To select one of numerous examples, the New York Times, in an editorial concerned with what it is, quote, to be learned now from Indochina, writes, quote, in Vietnam, clearly the North has vanquished South. The National Liberation Front that we would not admit to political power has been destroyed more surely by Hanoi than Washington ever dreamed it could be. A marvel of hypocrisy by the white frauds of the New York Times. As we described earlier, Washington didn't merely dream, but effectively killed the NLF, fish by the deliberate process of drying up the water, destroying the peasant society of South Vietnam, but consistent with a long tradition of apologetics, the Times editorial conveniently ignores the background of the alleged takeover. A second aspect of the partial U.S. victory in Vietnam is that most of the country, along with Laos and Cambodia, lies in ruins, so that a colossal task of reconstruction faces the survivors. The site continues to amaze even experienced war correspondents. John Pilger, who reported that for 10 years from Vietnam, writes after a recent visit that much of North Vietnam is a moonscape from which visible signs of life, houses, factories, schools, hospitals, pagodas, churches, have been obliterated. In some forests, there are no longer birds and animals, and there are lorry drivers who will not respond to the hooting of a horn because they are deaf from the incessant sounds of bombs. Vietnamese authorities report 30,000 cases of permanent deafness among children from the 1972 bombings alone. Pilger reports he describes napalm, especially created for Vietnam, that continues to smolder under the skin tissues through a lifetime of its victims. Areas bombed more heavily than Dresden, sites such Vin bombed so heavily. Areas bombed more heavily than Dresden. Cities such as Vin bombed so heavily that not even the foundations of buildings remain, and where now people live on the edge of famine with rice rations lower than Bangladesh. These consequences of the U.S. war are also regularly exploited by Western commentators who point to the extraordinary difficulties in reconstructing some kind of existence from the wreckage as proof of communist iniquity. These partial victories are important. To preserve the image of U.S. benevolence, always a crucial element in imperial ideology, it is necessary to preserve in the popular mind the big American lie that the United States was indeed engaged in defense against aggression, as was constantly proclaimed by Dean Rusk, Arthur Schlesinger, and other propagandists. As noted, the dominant role of the North in the final stages of the war and after, a direct result of the U.S. success in demolishing the South, contributes to the preservation of this myth and is regularly exploited to this end by journalists and scholars. There was an equally important benefit flowing from the devastation. Internal documents reveal that a major concern of U.S. planners has always been the demonstration effect of potential communist success, which might serve as a model for nationalist movements elsewhere in Western-dominated regions. The primary U.S. goal in the Third World is to ensure that it remains open to U.S. economic penetration and political control. Failing this, the United States exerts every effort to ensure that societies that try to strike an independent course, specifically those that are called quote-unquote communist in contemporary political jargon, will suffer the harshest conditions that U.S. power can impose so as to keep the rot from spreading by ideological successes in the terminology employed by U.S. global planners. Though the United States was unable to subdue the nationalist movements of Indochina, it has attained its secondary goal. In addition to the immense problems of underdevelopment that burden the former Western colonies, the countries of Indochina must somehow confront the task of overcoming the ravages of U.S. war without reparations or aid from the United States, and indeed in the face of continued U.S. opposition, even to aid from elsewhere. Now that the countries of Indochina have been pounded to dust, Western ideologists are less fearful of the demonstration effect of successful communism and exult in the current willingness of the Western satellites of ASEAN to engage in peaceful competition. In the London Observer Group, Gavin Young reports on ASEAN's program of obliterating communism, not with bombs but with prosperity, under the leadership of the smiling humanitarian Marcos Lee Kuan Yew, Suharto, Hussein An of Malaysia, and General Krangkak of Thailand, with his dark, puckish face, at once warm-hearted and mischievous. These benevolent leaders understand the priorities, slum clearance, rural poverty, and are now firmly setting out to eradicate the ills of their societies, as Young discovered when he interviewed them on the golf courses. No one without access to the golf courses is interviewed, nor is there any discussion of the conditions under which most of the populations of these potentially wealthy countries live, or why this situation persists, or concerning the past and ongoing atrocities conducted by the genial golfers and the ASEAN colleagues under the Western aegis. Imagine what the reaction would be in the West to a featured article in the press explaining how wondrous Asian communism is becoming, based exclusively on interviews with Kim Tu-sung, Pol Pot, etc. The comparison, once again, is informative as to the true character of the free press. Equally informative is the fact that it does not occur to the author or editors to note that this willingness to see what the system which system works best followed many years of working to liberate communism with bombs, with an impact on the victims that has conveniently been forgotten by the free American press. The US government also suffered a defeat at home, but again, only a partial defeat. In the 1960s, the mass popular movement developed, unprecedented in scale and commitment, opposing the U.S. war in Vietnam. Contrary to common beliefs, the articulate intelligentsia remained largely loyal to the state propaganda system, and with some exceptions, only rarely approached even the periphery of this popular movement. Their opposition to the war, which developed at about the same time and for the same reasons as opposition to business circles, was highly qualified and fundamentally unprincipled. The United States simply could not get away with what it was doing at a reasonable cost. Typical current assessments on the part of U.S. liberals run along these lines. The American engagement in Vietnam continues to seem more bumbleheaded than evil. The progress of the war still appears to have been based upon a compendium of false analogies, at bad guesses, and self-righteousness. Much of this war termed evil at the time, but the name callers often created their own faulty analogies and exhibited notably self-righteous qualities. The assessment is made without regard to the morality of the American engagement. Johnson's policy was not repudiated by left or right-wing critics, but by the traditional logic of pragmatism. It did not work. The Tet Offensive provided the most dramatic evidence. No one could say for sure whether the Americans had won or lost the Tet because no one was certain of the terms of victory and defeat. Such ambiguity sits poorly on the American psyche. Note the quotes around the word morality. Only the acts of enemies of the state are to be assumed in moral terms. Note also the initial finding of an absence of quote unquote evil, and the later revelation that morality, quote unquote, is outside the terms of discussion. Apart from the inane reference to the American psyche, quote unquote, Raw's conclusion is accurate enough. The logic of pragmatism swayed not only Johnson, but also most of the liberal critics of the war. To cite another example, consider the op-ed by Charles Peters, editor-in-chief of the liberal muckraking journal Washington Monthly, in the New York Times, October 24th, 1977. He is concerned to heal the terrible wound that the war left with us by finding some common ground between the left and the right, both of whom must concede that they were in part wrong. The error of the right was that the massive escalation in 1965 was wrong, and that the effort to bomb the North Vietnamese into submission was stupid. We began to go wrong in 1965 with our campaign of mass slaughter against the Vietnamese. And we were wrong when we forced draftees to fight and die in what could best be described as a morally ambiguous situation. The slaughter of over 150,000 South Vietnamese by 1965, the U.S. bombing of villages, massed forced population removal, and institution and support for Demas sub-fascist terror in an effort to overcome the disaster of the Geneva Accords, the earlier support for French imperialism against what was always understood to be the nationalist movement of Vietnam. All of this before we began to go wrong. Furthermore, we weren't wrong, quote unquote, to try to help the South with supplies and volunteers, any more than the American left was wrong to give such help to the Loyalists during the Spanish Civil War. This much is common ground. Where was the left wrong is in that it surely must concede that there was, in fact, a substantial part of the population who did not want to live under communism. The left needs to overcome its racist tendency to say that while Europeans should have democracy, communism is just dandy for the yellow people. A complete captive of the assumption of the war propagandists, Peter is unable to comprehend that opponents of the war were insisting that Vietnam should be left to the Vietnamese, not to whatever fate is determined for them by the likes of Walt Rostow, Henry Kissinger, or the myriad sycophants of the Peters variety. To regard that commitment as quote-unquote racist reveals moral standards that are quite on par with the intellectual level indicated by Peters' belief that opponents of the war must now concede that there were many anti-communists in Vietnam. A great insight no doubt. His implication that the United States was fighting for democracy, quote unquote, for the yellow people in South Vietnam is ideological claptrap, refuted by the consistent U.S. support for terror regimes in South Vietnam and indeed throughout the sub-fascist empire of Southeast Asia, as illustrated throughout Volume 1. We may compare Peter's plea for healing the wounds of war with that of William Colby, as illustrated in this item, which we quote in toto from the Boston Globe. Former CIA Director William Colby, who directed the pacification program during the Vietnam War, said the United States and the communist government of Vietnam should forget past animosities and build a relationship of respect and friendship. Both countries should agree to consign the misdeeds of the past to the mists of history, Colby said. In keeping with the same desire for reconciliation, it is natural that Henry Kissinger, who bears heavy responsibility for the Indochinese slaughter, should be honored by the Humanitarian Award of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, Boston Globe, September 17, 1977. Other journalist commentary is similar. At the war's end, the liberal Washington Post warned that the debate over the war must be balanced. For if much of the actual conduct of the Vietnam policy over the years was wrong and misguided, even tragic, it cannot be denied that some part of the purpose of that policy was right and defensible. Specifically, it was right to hope that the people of South Vietnam would be able to decide on their own form of government and social order. The American public is entitled, indeed obligated, to explore how good impulses came to be transmuted into bad policy, but we cannot afford to cast out all remembrances of that earlier impulse. For the fundamental lesson of Vietnam surely is that we are capable of error and on a gigantic scale. That is the spirit in which postmortems on Vietnam ought now to go forward. Not just the absence of recrimination, but also the presence of insight and honesty is required to bind up the nation's wounds. Note the typical assumption that, quote, we decided to undertake and pursue the Vietnam War. Note also the crucial words wrong, misguided, tragic, error. That as far as insight and honesty can carry us in reaching our judgment. The Post, incidentally, does not assign a date to the quote-unquote early impulse to help the people of South Vietnam decide on their own form of government and social order, a wise oversight on their part. Similarly, the most outspoken dove of the New York Times in the later stages of the war, Anthony Lewis, sums up the history of the war as follows. The early American decisions on Indochina can be regarded as blundering efforts to do good. But by 1969, it was clear to most of the world and most Americans that the intervention had been a disastrous mistake. One nation-building effort was a delusion, and no amount of arms or dollars or blood could ever make it work. The lesson of Vietnam is that deceit does not pay. We should avoid mistakes and lies, keep to policies that succeed and are accurately portrayed. That is the lesson of Vietnam. The regular commentator of the liberal New Republic, Richard Strout, also sees the war as, quote, one of the greatest blunders of our history. It was not wickedness, it was stupidity. These conclusions he wrote from Paris, where he had been visiting monuments to Hitler's crimes. The emotional impact was overwhelming. I hated the maniac, Hitler crew. I could never forgive the Germans. But then he thought of Vietnam, reaching the conclusions just cited. The maniac Hitler crew was presumably not guilty merely of blunders and stupidity. Strout does not raise the question whether the cruelty of quote-unquote maniacs is more or less wicked than the cold-blooded decisions and rationally imposed terror of Washington politicians and military bureaucrats tabulating body counts and contracting for improved fragmentation bombs. We wonder how Stout would react to looking at mile after mile of lunar craters, razed villages, and the graves of hundreds of thousands of permanently pacified peasants. The beauty of nationalism is that whatever the means your state employs, since the leadership also proclaims noble objectives and a nationalist Can swallow these. Wickedness is ruled out, and stupidity explains all despicable behavior. It is only for assorted enemies that we look closely at real objectives and apply the more serious observation that means are both important in themselves as measure of evil and inseparably related to and interactive with ends. Bertrand Russell was one of the few who sought to bring some understanding of this chapter of imperial violence into the public arena, unfortunately to little effect. In 1964, he criticized the editorial stand of the U.S. Social Democratic journal Dissent, which opposed U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam as something quite as inhumane as the policy of hopeless attrition of the Vietnamese people. Their reason was that withdrawal of U.S. forces would almost certainly be followed by a slaughter in the South and of all those who fought against the communists. The editor seemed oblivious to the likely consequence of a U.S. Saigon victory, though the record of Deem's murderous assault on the opposition with United States backing was well known. Particularly revealing is the tacit assumption that the United States has the authority to intervene to impose its concept of humanity. As the war ended, the Dissent editors commented that the position they had taken was correct, though one might question the nuances. In particular, nothing in the intervening years led them to question the tacit assumption just noted. If the U.S. government is to be faulted, it is for the manner in which it has executed its mission. Russell's warning and analysis went unheeded. On these crucial issues, the, quote, democratic socialists of dissent adopted the fundamental assumptions of spokesmen for the U.S. imperialist state. In 1975, they proceeded to run a symposium asking whether, in the light of events in post-war Cambodia, we should rethink our opposition to the Vietnam War. We will not comment here on the astonishing assumption that even permit the question to be raised. To cite one last example of a record that might extend to a full book in itself, consider the criticism of Gloria Emerson's Winners and Losers by Homer Bygard, a highly respected war correspondent of the New York Times, for her intolerance towards those who find Vietnam, quote, a less moral crime than the thunderously stupid military blunder of throwing 500,000 ground troops in an unwinnable war. Had the war been winnable, or had there been less stupidity in fighting it, then the original U.S. aggression and the consequences of the victims would have been no quote-unquote moral crime, according to this, again, quite typical reaction by someone who's generally regarded as a critic of the war. Throughout the war, U.S. liberalism kept pretty much within the limits of responsible thinking as defined by the requirements of state propaganda. At one extreme, there was Joseph Alsop, who believed that we could win, and at the other, Arthur Schlesinger, who expressed his doubts while adding that we all pray that Mr. Alsop will be right, and explaining that if, contrary to his expectations, U.S. policy succeeds, we may all be saluting the wisdom and statesmanship of the American government in conducting a war that was turning Vietnam into, quote, a land of ruin and wreck. The popular movement of opposition to the war was doubly threatening to U.S. elites. In the first place, the movement developed out of the control of its natural leaders, thus posing a grave threat to order and stability. What is more, the general passivity and obedience on the part of the population that is a basic requirement in a state committed to counter-revolutionary intervention was overcome in significant measure, and dangerous feelings of sympathy developed toward movements of national liberation in the Third World. It is an important task for the intelligentsia in the post-war period to reconstruct the ideologic systems and to reinstate the patterns of conformism that were shattered by the opposition and resistance to the U.S. war in Indochina. The task is eased by the absence of an organized left in the United States, either as a mass movement or among the intelligentsia. As long has been noted, the The United States is quite unusual among the industrial democracies in this regard. We cannot explore the causes here, but one should note that the state represents that state repression is not an insignificant factor. Picking up the pieces, a return to counter-revolutionary intervention. Despite domestic opposition and protest, the basic institutions of U.S. society survived the Indochina crisis undamaged and unchanged, since the global interests of U.S.-based multinational corporations have led the United States to militarization and worldwide counter-revolutionary intervention are completely intact. We must assume that the same forces will prevail in the future to both direct and indirect intervention when the need arises. Even before the Vietnam War had ended, there appeared to be a spate of articles in the U.S. press and journals, some by opponents of the Vietnam War, urging U.S. military intervention in the Arab oil-producing state. In a secret memorandum leaked to the press in January 1978, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown ordered the armed services to plan a highly mobile force of up to 100,000 troops backed by air and naval units for possible rapid intervention in the Persian Gulf and other areas outside of Europe. Commentators across the narrow spectrum of articulate U.S. opinion who reflect basic power forces in the United States are restless and concerned that the Vietnam hang-up may pose obstacles to the use of force to protect the national interest, a mystification favored by ideologues to refer to the interests of those small groups who dominate the domestic economy and play a major role in setting foreign policy. The more general context is an attempt to heat up the Cold War, which has served both superpowers so effectively as a cover for enlarging the military budget and creating the psychological environment for imperial intervention. President Carter, despite his sharp expansion of military outlays and general moves to restore an atmosphere of great power conflict, has been criticized by liberals as well as conservatives for failing to develop a consistently aggressive posture and to proceed forthrightly to develop such new weapon systems as a neutron bomb. In a typical lament, the Wall Street Journal editorial of July 12, 1978 observes sagely that, quote, in the past few months, the Soviets have been toppling third world nations like dominoes in accord with their assessment that this president and this administration can be successfully bullied, an assessment repeatedly borne out ever since their brutal rejection of the new administration's strategic arms proposals quickly brought forth a U.S. retreat in the negotiations. The strategic balance is shifting in favor of the USSR, while, quote, on the psychological level, meanwhile, the U.S. has been wallowing in the wake of Vietnam, reducing defense spending and dismantling much of the CIA to prevent even harsher Soviet bullying in the future. The administration should forget about travel schedules and get about such business as reversing the decision, postponing the neutron warhead, building a workable covert capability for the CIA, and accelerating the development of the cruise missile. In short, back to the good old days. One must at least admire the audacity of U.S. ideologists. Thus, only in a few months after the war in Indochina ended, we find the respected political analyst Theodore Draper explaining that the Soviet Union has had much more experience than the Americans have had in defining their interests on a global basis, rather than on a solely continental basis for almost 6 decades. As evidence, he cites 2 examples, Russian support for North Korea and North Vietnam. Surely these examples amply demonstrate how Russian imperialism surpasses the timid and hesitant United States in its extent, its scale, and the vigor with which it pursues its global objectives. Such amazing commentary is not unusual among the intelligentsia, can easily be understood on the assumption that the United States is merely engaged in blundering efforts to do good when it bombs dams in North Korea in an effort to starve the population to submission, or drives the peasants of South Vietnam into protected areas, not to speak of earlier efforts in the Philippines and elsewhere. Even as the Vietnam War was reaching final stage, Kissinger directed the CIA to carry out subversion in Angola and to support a South African invasion and attacks from Zaire, setting off a Russian and Cuban counter-reaction in support of the MPLA in Angola, which predictably is regularly offered by imperial apologists as proof of the decline of the West in the face of Russian aggression. While President Carter has not taken a sufficiently militant stance to justify the editorialists of the New Republic and the Wall Street Journal, nevertheless, on occasion, he has been gratifyingly belligerent. In his Wake Forest address of March 1978, Carter proclaimed that, quote, "For many years, the U.S. has been truly a global power. Our longstanding concerns encompass our own security interests and those of our allies and friends beyond this hemisphere in Europe. We have important responsibilities to enhance peace in East Asia, the Middle East, the Persian Gulf, in our own hemisphere. We have the will, and we must also maintain the capacity to honor our commitments and to protect our interests in the critical areas." He also announced that the Pentagon is improving and will maintain quickly deployable forces, air, land, and sea, to defend our interests throughout the world, and defended his increase of the military budget in violation of campaign pledges and contrary to Wall Street Journal fantasies. After a brief eclipse, the defense intellectuals are once again receiving a respectful hearing from liberal commentators when they call for the use of force to ensure access to vital resources or to protect embattled investments abroad. Parker deserves praise. The liberal analyst of the Washington Post explains, "For defining sharply one alternative to a wiser policy, Stephen Rosenfield is impressed with Parker's analysis of the current North-South conflict, resulting from the present stage of the political mobilization of the Third World following centuries of Western dominance." Parker is dealing with elements of the real world that too few other people are willing to look in the eye. Rosenfield admiringly reports, even though one can argue that with this or that assumption, whether our frustration in coping with the post-war world leads with Parker to a reliance on force or to the new forms of accommodation is the question of the age. History gives a good indication of how this question will be resolved and how the liberal intelligentsia will react when it is resolved. The close association of domestic liberalism and international militancy is a familiar phenomenon. The liberal intellectual of the New Republic circle took credit for leading an unwilling nation into World War I, victimized, as they failed to perceive, by a most effective British campaign of atrocity fabrication. See below Chapter 2, Section 1. In more recent times, the liberal intelligentsia have given crucial support to programs of counter-revolutionary violence justified in terms of containment and the other instruments of Cold War rhetoric. The euphoria over Kennedy's program of militarization, international subversion, and brinkmanship is a familiar example. In fact, the liberal intelligentsia were as critical of Eisenhower for his insufficient militancy as many of them are now of Carter for his vacillation in the face of threats to U.S. interests. In summary, there is every reason to suppose that the traditional U.S. government policies of international subversion and, when circumstances warrant, overt aggression will continue to, quote, "ensure access to the vital resources or to protect embattled investments abroad or the opportunity for future expansion of U.S.-based capital." The sources of these programs in domestic U.S. society have undergone no significant change, and the intelligentsia can be expected to resume their traditional role, somewhat eclipsed by the trauma of the war in Indochina, in support of state violence and terror. They will construct an appropriate version of history and an interpretation of the contemporary world that will enlist popular support for these programs, or at least ensure the requisite degree of passivity and unconcern. It is this context that we must approach the investigation of how the propaganda system is coming to terms with the development of post-war Indochina. So that's it. That's chapter one. This setting. So we wanted to make some comments. The first is that the United States government are anti-Asian, gun-violent mafia, warmonger, war criminals. They are violent anti-Asian murderers and racist oppressors. And what they did in Indochina just shows that the gun-violent murderers of anti-Asian, politic are, responsible for the wholesale slaughter of the poor Indochinese people. They were peasant society. It was clear it was a peasant society. They were bombed into submission by the U.S. warmonger war criminals. And, it went over and over again. He describes multiple situations, multiple examples of this aggression. We also noted some other things. The fact that the warmonger, butcher, the Gestapo of the United States, Henry Kissinger, got some sort of award from the Christians and Jewish Society. All right, in keeping with the same desire for reconciliation, it is natural that Henry Kissinger, who is the Gestapo and bears responsibility for the Indochinese slaughter, should also be honored with the humanitarian award of the National Conference of Christians and Jews, cited in the Boston Globe from September 1977. So that's clear. I mean, the U.S. government, they honor these mass butchers, these Roman Catholic murderers, or their Jewish counterparts with awards, with public awards that are humanitarian. This is a racist war of the United States, murderous anti-Asian, war criminal, warmonger, gun violent mafia gangsters. That's what this war is. This chapter describes a group of mafia gangsters that are warmongers and war criminals that conducted a slaughter campaign against the Asian people of Indochina. And that was the thing. And then the other thing we found is, the Western press. The Western press is a racist group of white frauds. It is all, propaganda. It is lies. It is garbage. When it comes to war, they change from being, a complete deceitful group to just, open fabrication, open lies, just, broad scale deceit so that you don't have any clue what's going on. That's ultimately what it is. As a general rule, they, are, readable, but, the U.S. press is not readable. As a general rule, the U.S. press is completely unreadable. It is a fabrication group of state propagandists, frauds, and deceitful liars. They have, complete agendas and everything. It is kind of a mafia journalism of the United States government. But, the Western press is readable, but, when it comes to war, it becomes a fabrication, racist foray of, fraudulence. So similar, it kind of degenerates to the U.S. press. And, we talked about, the basic things is, all of these people, like President Carter was discussed, the humanitarian, Gestapo butcher, Jimmy Carter and his, campaign of human rights. We'll be getting to the humanitarian human rights man, Jimmy Carter, who is, responsible for slitting, infants, Hispanic infants in El Salvador, for throwing Hispanic infants in the air and having them machine gunned by the El Salvadoran, government troops, which are U.S. colonial fascist dictatorship. These are all discussed in Turning the Tide, another book by Noam Chomsky, showing that Carter, rather than being a humanitarian, is a Gestapo. He is a butcher of Washington. So let's continue the precedents, the intelligentsia and the state. In considering the refraction of events in Indochina through the prism of Western ideology, it is useful to bear in mind some relevant precedents. The first class of precedents has to do with the ways in which influential segments of the intelligentsia have responded in the past to abuses of state power. The second, with the record of treatment of former enemies after revolutionary, civil, and other military conflicts. Consider first the typical relations of the intelligentsia to state power. Quite commonly, intellectuals have a strong moral attachment to some favored state, usually their own, and have devoted themselves to lauding its alleged achievements, sometimes real, and concealing its abuses and crimes. At times, quote, the herd of independent minds, Harold Rosenberg's apt phrase, has succeeded in virtually stifling opposing views. One recalls, for example, the reaction to George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia at a time when Stalinist loyalties were influential. Well, one may also imagine how he would have reacted to its rediscovery and conversion to a Cold War document when fashions changed. Similarly today, when support for Israel has taken on some of the characteristics of the earlier Stalinism of the intellectuals, it has been difficult for studies critical of one or another aspect of Israeli policies to find a publisher, or if published, to receive an honest appraisal in the United States. When the herd stampedes in a different direction for one reason or another and service to some favored foreign state no longer has its earlier appeal, we enter the God that failed phase, which at one time had a certain validity and integrity, but now has become all too often a pose for those who adopt the more typical stance of the intelligentsia, namely service to the propaganda system of their own state. To this end, it is often convenient to manufacture past allegiance for the current enemies against which recrimination are directed. The normal case of a straight chauvinist bias is, of course, of central importance in shaping the responses and defining the role of mainstream intellectuals, in part for reasons we have already discussed in Volume 1, Chapter 1, Section 16. A primary social role of the group that Isaiah Berlin called the secular priesthood is to speak of positively of the institutions and objectives of the state and dominant power interests within it in order to help mobilize public commitment and loyalty. The adaptability of the intellectuals to quality variation in the social order for which devotion is sought has proven to be very great, that pre-Civil War Southern intelligentsia even found the slave system worth cherishing despite its economic inefficiency. Quote, slave labor can be so cheap as what is called free labor on the grounds of its sheer humanity and social beneficence. What is lost to us from inefficiency is gained by humanity. A further traditional role of intellectuals is to disseminate propaganda concerning the evil practices, real or fabricated, of current enemies of the state. It is remarkable to see how susceptible intellectuals have been over the years to the machinations of the atrocity fabrication industry. A classic example is the success of the British propaganda agencies in whipping up hysteria in the United States over alleged, quote, Hun atrocities during World War I, particularly among intellectual circles committed to war after the 1916 presidential election, which Wilson had won on a pledge of peace. It was in the group known as intellectuals. H.C. Peterson points out in his study of British efforts to induce Americans to support their cause, quote, that the best body of propagandists was enlisted. The efforts resulted in the enlistment of most of the leaders of the intellectual life in America. It was an imposing propaganda group. Prominent men of America hastened to join a cause that was intellectually fashionable, and college professors and school teachers repeated with a great show of wisdom the arguments which had originated in the British and French propaganda services, whereas in contradistinction to the easy surrender of American leaders was the stubborn pacifism of the great mass of the population. Particularly effective among the intellectuals was the Bryce Report, produced in 1915 by a committee of inquiry chaired by Viscount Bryce, a venerable scholar and a former ambassador to the United States, beyond suspicion of Germanophobia, as admitted by even German critics, because of long association with German universities and receipt of highest honors from the Kaiser. His committee also included other distinguished intellectuals and jurists. Its report was widely circulated throughout the world and scored its greatest success in the United States, where it was widely printed in full and had an overwhelming effect on the American mind and heart. Daily Mail. Lord Bryce was initially skeptical of atrocity propaganda and hoped that his committee would reduce within a small compass the burden of the charge, according to an associate. But he was convinced by the compelling mass of evidence that had been gathered and became an advocate of a fight to the finish. The committee relied on some 1,200 depositions, mostly by Belgian refugees in England, some by Belgian and British soldiers, as well as diaries of German soldiers, regarded as the most weighty part of the evidence in the report itself. The depositions were taken by 20 barristers. The committee was aware of the problems posed by refugee testimony and raised the case for skepticism in the introduction of the report. It is natural to ask whether much of the evidence given, especially by Belgian witnesses, may not be due to excitement or overstrained emotions, and whether, apart from deliberate falsehood, people who mean to speak the truth may not, in a more or less hysterical condition, have been imagining themselves to have seen things which they said they saw. But the committee was so careful in sifting and evaluating the material that they felt they had overcome this difficulty. The 1,200 depositions, incidentally, have not been found. The report cites innumerable atrocities of the most fiendish sort. However, a Belgian commission of inquiry in 1922, conducting its investigations of the scene of alleged atrocities, failed to confirm these atrocious crimes and was in general far more restrained. Reed himself concludes that, quote, the refugees naturally desired to convince their English hosts that they had fled from monsters, and discounts the Bryce report, which in retrospect contains little that is credible. According to Peterson, a large percent of the events making up the report was based on second and third hand information. Rumors and opinions were included uncritically. It is not impossible that many of the statements used were the product of leading questions. Incomplete versions of the actual events were the basis of the report. In addition, the official report of the British government dignified a great many old wives' tales and considerable barrack-room gossip. So we're talking about the British atrocity fabrication, the fabrication of the the slave, the slave system. Hun atrocities during World War II, World War I, the Hun atrocities during World War I. We are discussing the British fabrication, the British government fabrication, racist, made up lies of atrocities of the Hun that were backed by Wilson administration, the racist American white. The report of one story, Peterson notes, this, of course, is but a rewrite of standard wartime atrocity story. Senator Cullen of Nebraska used it in 1898. Of another, the story is undoubtedly the work of someone's feverish imagination. The Bryce report is perhaps the most important example of available of a careful analysis of refugee reports on the part of a group attempting to reassess the crimes of an enemy state. It was compiled under near optimal conditions and should be carefully borne in mind when evaluating such reports or alleged reports under far more ambiguous circumstances from much more dubious sources. While U.S. intellectuals assured one another that the nation had entered the war under the influence of a moral verdict reached after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community, it is not unlikely that the British and French propagandists who were feeding these myths about babies with their hands hacked off by German barbarians, etc., were laughing up their sleeves. Very soon, U.S. scholars took their own initiatives, as when a group of historians engaged in what one called historical engineering, explaining the issues of the war that we might the better win it, produce such material as the German Bolshevik conspiracy, a series of forged documents, as was suspected in Europe at the time, purporting to show that the Germans had materially assisted the Bolsheviks in coming to power and that the Bolshevik leaders were paid agents of the German general staff. And intelligence services has become more sophisticated, or at least better funded. They have learned to play upon the willingness of the more thoughtful members of the community to believe the worst about official enemies of the state to which they are devoted. One technique is to arrange for scholarly studies, such as the book by Hong Van Chi, which had such remarkable success in establishing the mythology concerning the bloodbaths during the North Vietnamese land reform. Another device is to plant stories in the foreign press to be picked up by quote-unquote witting or perhaps witless journalists and others. The CIA recognized long ago that foreign correspondents are particularly susceptible to such deception, since they so often tend to rely on local context for their insights, quote-unquote. If these locals can be enlisted in the cause, the news can be properly arranged by the source. Some interesting examples of how it is done appear in the memoirs of Joseph Smith, a CIA agent who was impelled by the appearance of Philip Agee's exposure of the CIA to write in defense of the agency. He describes, for example, how he enlisted a local newsman in Singapore on whom the big-name foreign correspondents relied for all their scoops and legwork. One of the useful contributions of the subordinate was to file a fake story attributed to the British defense officials reporting that the Chinese were sending troops and supplies to the Viet Minh just prior to the 1954 Geneva Conference. The purpose was to undermine the conception that the Viet Minh as a purely indigenous Vietnamese group of national patriots by identifying them with the world communist movement, thus strengthening the Western-backed groups at Geneva. Smith explains, other CIA stations were alerted, quote, to have their press assets ready to pick the story up and make sure it was used in as many newspapers as possible. There is little doubt that such intelligence machinations have influenced scholarship. One of the standard claims about the early stages of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, faithfully repeated by John Fairbank, Edwin Reischauer, and other leading Asian scholars, is that the U.S. intervention was grounded in a tragic error. The false belief that Ho Chi Minh was a frontline agent for the international communist conspiracy. Had we not been so naive and uninformed, so unpracticed in the ways of imperialism, we would have perceived that Vietnamese communism was in reality a national movement and had been spared the American tragedy of Vietnam. This claim is thoroughly refuted by the documentary record, which reveals that from the beginning, U.S. analysts understood perfectly well that the source of Viet Minh's strength lay in its credentials as the leading force in Vietnamese nationalism, and that after the United States determined to intervene for quite rational imperial motives that are carefully outlined in planning documents and just as carefully excluded from the scholarly record, efforts were set in motion to establish the preferred but false quote-unquote facts necessary to justify this intervention, namely that the Viet Minh were really agents of Moscow or quote-unquote Peiping. No mainstream scholarship can be trusted to conform to the requisite mythology, just as in the true totalitarian societies. Smith is not the only CIA source for information on news management. To cite only one further case, consider Snep's account of the last days of the Saigon regime, also presented from the standpoint of quite favorable to the general goals of the CIA, though critical of its errors. He points out, for example, that the U.S. Embassy in Saigon organized a noisy press campaign around recent reports that the communists were torturing and mutilating recalcitrant civilians in newly captured areas, in the hope that this would generate sympathy for the South Vietnamese. But the campaign had the unwanted effect of sparking panic and chaos among the South Vietnamese population itself. Snep also cites his notebook reference to the atrocity stories now imaginatively embroidered by Saigon radio, the local press, and the embassy. At the ambassador's orders, Joe Bennett, the political counselor, is still zealously churning out his share of them, playing on third-hand reports relayed out of Ban Mi Thuat by a Buddhist monk. They're tearing out women's fingernails up there and chopping up the town council. One of Bennett's young staffers advised me gleefully this afternoon that should turn some heads in Congress. The ambassador and CIA chief Snep reports apparently consider the latest crop too useful to risk putting them into any test of veracity. Again, he notes, the stories terrorize the Vietnamese. Perhaps the most cynical of atrocity management that Snep cites was Operation Baby Lift, which in a sense was a fraud from the start, in which children who had been languishing for years in Saigon's orphanages and were in no immediate danger from communist offensive, were in effect kidnapped and flown out of the country to the United States in the hope, expressed by Ambassador Martin, that the spectacle of hundreds of Vietnamese babies being taken under the American wing would generate sympathy for the South Vietnamese cause around the world. Not all of them made it. Over 200 were killed in the crash of a C-5A air transport, somewhat diluting the intended propaganda effect, though the operation continued. It is predictable that the exposure of such tactics from the source, as in the past, will have little or no effect in diminishing the credulity of Western intellectuals with regard to the next batch of atrocity stories. We have discussed other examples of atrocities management in Volume 1, Chapter 5. The will to believe patriotic truths and a positive desire to aid the cause of one's own state are dominant forces, and those abiding by such principles may also anticipate corresponding rewards and privileges. The general subservience of the articulate intelligentsia to the framework of state propaganda is not only unrecognized, it is stridently denied by the propaganda system. The press and the intelligentsia in general are held to be fiercely independent, critical, antagonistic to the state, even suffused by trendy anti-Americanism. It is quite true that the controversy rages over government policies and the errors or even crimes of the American government, officials, and agencies. But the impression of internal dissidence is misleading. A more careful analysis shows that this controversy takes place, for the most part, within the narrow limits of a set of patriotic premises. Thus, it is quite tolerable, indeed a contribution to the propaganda system, for the free American press to denounce the government for its quote-unquote errors in attempting to defend South Vietnam from North Vietnamese aggression, since by so doing it helps establish the more firm basic myth that the United States was not engaged in a savage attack on South Vietnam, but was rather defending it. Even if the hostile critics adopt these new assumptions, then clearly they must be true. The beauty of the democratic systems of thought control, as contrasted with their clumsy totalitarian counterparts, is that they operate by subtly establishing on a voluntary basis, aided by the force of nationalism and media control, by substantial interest, presuppositions that set the limits of debate rather than by imposing beliefs with a bludgeon. Then let the debate rage. The more lively and vigorous it is, the better the propaganda system is served, since the presupposition, U.S. benevolence, lack of rational imperial goals, defensive posture are even more firmly established. Those who do not accept the fundamental principles of state propaganda are simply excluded from the debate, or if noticed, dismissed as emotional, irresponsible, etc. In a typical example, when the New York Times of April 5th, 1975 gave its retrospective assessment of the Vietnam tragedy, it is referred to, quote, the decade of fierce polemics to be resolved in due course by Clio, the goddess of history, between the hawks who thought that the United States could win and the doves who were convinced that the U.S. objective was unattainable. Those who opposed the war in principle, specifically the mainstream of the peace movement, were simply not part of the debate as far as the Times was concerned. Their position need not be refuted. It does not exist. An excellent illustration of how the ideologic institutions operate to buttress the state propaganda system by identifying the media as hypercritical, so much so as to endanger free institutions, is provided by a 2-volume Freedom House study of the alleged bias and incompetence of the media in portraying the Tet Offensive as a defeat for the United States, and thus contributing to the failure of U.S. arms by their excessive pessimism. The name Freedom House, quote unquote, should at once arouse a certain skepticism among the people attuned to the machinations of modern propaganda systems, just as any good student of Orwell should have realized that a change in the name of the U.S. War Department to Defense Department in 1947 signaled that henceforth the state would be shifting from defense to aggressive war. In fact, Freedom House is no less of an Orwellian construction as its record indicates. The study in question is in the Freedom House tradition, contrary to its intentions and stated conclusion. Any independent-minded reader should infer from its 1,500 pages of text and documents that the media were remarkably loyal to the basic doctrines of the state and tended to view the events of the period strictly from the government's point of view. But these facts, though obvious from the documents cited, completely escape the author and his Freedom House sponsors. Naturally, since they talk of an ordinary press subservience as a norm, what is most striking about the study, apart from its general ineptitude, are the premises adopted without comment throughout. The press is unjustifiably pessimistic if it tends to believe that U.S. force may not prevail in defending South Vietnam, and is optimistic if it expresses faith in the ultimate success of U.S. state violence. Pessimism is wrong even if it is based on fact and in conformity with the views of the Pentagon and CIA, as was often the case, specifically in the insistence in question. Since optimism is demanded irrespective of facts, the implications of this study is that, quote, responsible responsible media must deliberately lie in order to serve the state in an undeviatingly propagandist role. To summarize the first class of precedents, the intelligentsia have been prone to various forms of state worship, the most striking and significant being subservience to the propaganda systems of their own government and social institutions. This subservience often takes the form of childish credulity that is effectively exploited by the organizations that are devoted to atrocity, fabrication, and other modes of ideological control. Sometimes the credulity is feigned as the propagandist knowingly transmits a useful lie. All this serves as a warning that should be borne in mind as we approach the issues at hand. In light of history, we turn next to the second class of precedents, namely the record of retribution following other wars. Here one must be cautious with analogs. The U.S. war in Vietnam, later all of Indochina, reached levels of savagery and destructiveness that have rarely been paralleled, so that one might have anticipated the retribution by the victors would also pass well beyond normal levels. Nevertheless, it is useful to survey some of these normal levels as a suggestion for a baseline of evaluation of the situation in post-war Indochina. To begin with a recent example, consider the immediate aftermath of World War II, recalling that the United States was never attacked directly. Hawaii and the Philippines were colonies, so that the more primitive forms of vengeance were not to be expected. The U.S. Army of Occupation in Japan, according to Japanese sources, indulged in rape, pillage, and murder. But that perhaps is to be expected of a conquering army. So let us consider the cooler and more considered behavior of the political leadership. In Japan, some 5,700 Japanese were tried on conventional war crimes charges, and 920 of these men were executed, while an administrative purge removed over 200,000 Japanese, at least temporarily, from political activity. Some of the trials were sheer farce. For example, the trial and execution of General Yamashita for crimes committed by troops over which he had no control whatsoever. The principles on which the precaution were based were outlined by Justice Robert H. Jackson in these terms. Our test of what is legally a crime gives recognition to those things which fundamentally outrage the conscience of the American people. I believe that those instincts of our people were right, and they should guide us as the fundamental tests of criminality. As many are comments, law so defined seems little different from Nazi law that had aroused so much antagonism among the Allies, specifically the Nazi law of 1935, which held that whoever commits an action which the law declares to be punishable or which is deserving of punishment according to the fundamental idea of penal law and the sound perception of the people that shall be punished. None of the defendants at Tokyo was accused of having personally committed an atrocity, meaning our rights, but only of having conspired to authorize such crimes or having failed to stop them. And no evidence was submitted that such crimes were government policy. One Japanese general was executed on the sole grounds that he had failed to take adequate steps to secure the observance and prevent breaches of convention and laws of war in respect of prisoners of war and civilian internees. Consider the fate of the U.S. military and political leadership if such standards were applied in the case of Vietnam. The sentence in this case was based on a split decision with a majority of 6 of 11 justices favoring the sentence of hanging that was administered. On the other executions, the court was split 7-4. The U.S. Uniform Code of Military Justice requires unanimity of a court-martial for sentencing to death and a 3/4 majority for confinement for more than 10 years. Keeping solely with the Tokyo Tribunal itself, of the 25 defendants, 7 were condemned to death by hanging, 2 died during the trial, and 6 more died in prison. Prime Minister Kono committed suicide when he learned of his arrest. Of the many procedural inadequacies of the tribunal, perhaps the most striking is that no neutral justices were appointed, let alone Japanese, but only representative of countries allied against Japan, including one justice who was a survivor of the Bataan Death March. Acts committed by the anti-Japanese alliance were excluded from consideration at the tribunal. An Indian Justice Pal commented in his impressive dissent, When the conduct of the nations is taken into account, the law will perhaps be found to be that only a lost war is a crime. There was, for example, no reference to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though, as Powell correctly remarked, nothing like this could be traced to the credit of the present accused. And as Justice Rowling of the Netherlands commented some years later, from the Second World War, above all, two things are remembered: the German gas chambers and the American atomic bombings. Though it is difficult to assign a measure, nevertheless, it seems likely that Western racism was a factor over and above the general submissiveness to the state propaganda system in permitting the atomic bombing to be so quickly forgotten, or more accurately, unheeded in the West. One of the leading statesmen of the other era, Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King of the Liberal Party, made the following entry in his diary on August 6, 1945. It is fortunate that the use of the bomb should have been upon the Japanese rather than upon the white races of Europe. Such sentiments are, of course, not to be publicly expressed. In fact, the Mackenzie King record of 1968 biographical project of King's literacy executors, the sentence is excised, though the diary was kept as a record to recount and explain the conduct of public affairs, and is described in the official Canadian military history as the most important single political document in 20th century Canadian history. The same distinguished statesman also urged in 1944 that all disloyal Japanese Canadians be deported as soon as physically possible, while those adjudged loyal should be dispersed. Those civil libertarian pressures on Canada prevented the enactment of this proposal or other racist measures of the sort instituted against the local population of Japanese origin in the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. Nevertheless, over 4,000 persons, many of whom were Canadian since birth, were shipped to devastated Japan in 1946 to 1947. Such vengeful and racist acts as in a tolerant and wealthy Western country, Western country, untouched by such vengeful and racist acts in a tolerant and wealthy Western country, untouched by Japanese aggression, are not recalled, needless to say, when the time comes to raise a chorus of protest justified on libertarian and humanist grounds that are foreign to Western thought and practice, against expulsions and oppression to post-war Indochina. The deep moral flaw of the Tokyo Tribunal noted above also undermines the moral basis for the Nuremberg Tribunal, which administered 12 death sentences to Nazi war criminals. The chief counsel for the prosecution at Nuremberg, Telford Taylor, has observed that since both sides had played the terrible game of urban destruction, the Allies far more successfully, there was no basis for criminal charges against German and Japanese, and in fact, no such charges were brought. The Nuremberg Tribunal was empowered to try and punish persons who, acting in the interest of the European Axis countries, committed any of the following crimes. The operational definition of war crime, quote unquote, is a criminal act committed by the defeated enemy and not allegedly by the victor. Only a lost war is a crime. Apart from the major war crimes trial, the Allies conducted a denazification procedure in occupied Germany, which was described by General Lucius Clay, who was responsible for the U.S. zone, as, quote, perhaps the most extensive legal procedure the world had ever witnessed. He reports, quote, in the U.S. zone alone, more than 13 million persons had been involved, of whom there 3 2/3 million were found chargeable, and of these some 800,000 persons were made subject to penalty for their party affiliations or actions. This procedure was regarded as an indication of the deep moral principle of the victors. The same is true of the current reaction to the Allied treatment of captured POWs. In Britain, there were some 400,000 German prisoners of war By autumn 1944, they were being used for forced labor as a form of reparation. Repatriation began in September 1946 and continued until the summer of 1948, over 3 years after the German surrender. After the war, too, POWs spent the harsh winter of 1945 to 1946 in tents in violation of the 1928 Geneva Convention. The POWs referred to themselves as slave labor with some justice. A stereotype was heard among the POWs that a venomous re-education drove back to National Socialism many a man who had honestly been seeking a new way of life. The stereotype endured in varying measure for the whole of captivity and as an expression of resentment beyond it. The psychological state of POWs changed from the anxiety and hope of the first half of 1946 to the depression and nihilism of 1948, according to Henry Falk. The British government naturally saw matters in a different light. The general aims of the re-education program, Falk writes, were to present the British Commonwealth of Nations as an example of a democratic community in action while avoiding the projection of Britain as a model to be slavishly copied. Falk does not explore the choice of representation of this democratic community as guest lecturers. Perhaps they did not include, for example, Jawaharlal Nehru, who observed that the ideology of British rule in India was that of the Heron folk and the master race, an idea that is, quote, inherent in imperialism and, quote, was proclaimed in unambiguous language by those in authority and put into practice as Indians as individuals were subjected to insult, humiliation, and contemptuous treatment. In the case of Britain, the abuse of German prisoners can be explained, if not justified, as revenge for the terror Britain suffered at the hands of residents of Hamburg and Dresden might have harbored similar thoughts. But no such justification can be brought to bear on the treatment of German POWs by the United States. Judith Gansberg, in a study based on recently declassified documents, provides an odd and admiring account of an unusual plan to re-educate the 372,000 German prisoners. The re-education program, she notes, adopted at the urging of Eleanor Roosevelt, was undoubtedly a violation of the spirit of the Geneva Convention's provisions against denationalization. It was a massive multimedia effort to bring about a democratic trend among the prisoners, which would not only change their views, but could also provide a vanguard for redirecting post-war Germany, and, quote, to return the men to Christian practices. It was run by a small group of talented and dedicated men and was a unique experiment in political reprogramming. On the most incorrigible Nazis, less than 10%, never succumbed to any efforts to re-educate them. Only the most incorrigible Nazis, less than 10%, never succumbed to any efforts to re-educate them. There were some difficulties in re-education. For example, some POWs were appalled by the treatment of blacks in the United States. But in general, it was regarded as a smashing success. The general tone is conveyed in a commencement address to the prisoners by Professor Howard Mumford Jones of Harvard. It may seem odd to appeal to the spirit of a prison camp and of a military installation, but what is the idea behind Fort Kearny unless it is the notion of human dignity and of the brotherhood of man? When therefore I say to you, it is my hope, as it is the hope of other members of this faculty, of officers of the post, and of your fellow prisoners, that the spirit of Fort Kearny may go with you wherever you are. I speak for these, your association, as well as for myself, no less than for the American government, which has sanctioned this amazing enterprise. May you be each one a good Christian soldier in the campaign against hatred and ill will. The first list of names of Fort Kearny prisoners to be repatriated was released in September 1945. Prisoners remained in the United States until July 1946. In September 1944, it was decided that re-education was an inappropriate term. An office memo states that the terms of re-education or reorientation of prisoners of war will not be used in referring to the mission of the branch. The term ID program, intellectual diversion, will be used whenever reference is made to the program. Re-education and intellectual diversion were not the only devices used to return the prisoners to Christian ways. A field intelligence officer admitted having shot a German captive in the head to induce his comrades to talk. But that was only a first step. The British beat prisoners to get information. Many stories of brutality were true in U.S. POW camps. Prisoners were starved into collapse, but no official actions were taken to modify these practices. In July 1944, a guard strafed POW tents, killing 8 among other atrocities. In the United States, as in Britain, prisoners were used for forced labor. Truman delayed repatriation for 60 days of POWs, essential for the harvest. POWs performed 20 million man-days of work on army posts and 10 million for contract employers, farm work, lumber industry, etc. Some were assigned to work at the Chemical Warfare Center of the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland. The amazing enterprise of re-education, rather intellectual diversion, has evoked much admiration in the United States. Reviewing Gansberg's book in the New York Times, February 1st, 1970, Thomas Lask writes that it was a startlingly original notion to work at converting German thinking, and no praise is too high for those United States Army men and educators who conceived and carried out the effort. He notes that the operation had to be carried out in secret. The Army did not want American POWs in Germany to be subjected to the same treatment. The book has some flaws. Lass believes it does not, for example, explore American innocence sufficiently, but in general, the re-education program must be regarded as one of marvels of American humanitarianism. To appreciate the quite amazing hypocrisy of this reaction, indeed of the book itself, it is necessary to turn to the flood of denunciations of the barbarity of the Vietnamese in conducting a program of re-education, which includes rehabilitation of the hundreds of thousands of drug addicts, prostitutes, torturers, and other debris left by the U.S. war during exactly the same period. Evidently, it all depends on whose ox is being gored. The aftermath of World War II was not limited to the pleasures of military occupation, pillage, rape, and murder. Judicial murder, intellectual diversion, years of forced labor, occasional killings of POWs in prison camps, massive purges and other such humane practices for the defeated, and massacres, union busting by gangsters, and so on for victors with the wrong politics as determined by their liberators. It has also included direct retribution against collaborators with the Nazis on a scale that is not appreciated in the West, though it has been well documented. French historian of the resistance Robert Aron is one of those who has honestly faced the grim task of determining the facts. He cites police and other reports of murderous reprisals up to 10 months after the liberation of practically the whole country, including collective massacres discovered many months after when mass graves were located. Many of the facts are unknown because the families of the victims had often been terrorized and preferred to conceal their misfortunes rather than go to the authorities. Aaron cites journal figures of 50,000 killed, but notes correctly that such estimates must be regarded as figures adopted lightly in a climate of excitement by which the armies in a campaign of frightened civilian populations crystallize their emotions. He also cites the study of Pleiber Grandjean, one of the victims of the liberation, who made an effort to give an objective account of the number of atrocities in Écrits de Paris. The facts he gives are for the most part exact, but he exaggerates the conclusion he draws from them. Pleiber Grandjean estimated that the number of massacred at 7 million, no doubt an exaggeration. Aaron undertook a careful study basing himself in part on detailed information provided by the French gendarmerie. He concludes that the number of killed in summary executions just prior to or after liberation must be at a minimum between 30 and 40,000. Approximately one Frenchman in 1,000 was the victim to the excesses committed at the liberation. Translating to South Vietnam, where the war was far more brutal and the aggressors and their collaborators exercised incomparably greater violence than the Nazis did in France, we would have some 20,000 murdered at the time of liberation. Or if we accept the figures of victims of the liberation, with the credulity typical of Western commentators in the case of Indochina, about 3 million outright murders. Fortunately, the Vietnamese did not keep to the standards of Western humanism. We might add that the massacres in France were carried out during the period when General Eisenhower, under a directive from President Roosevelt, issued with Churchill's approval, exercised supreme authority in France and the ultimate determination of where, when, and how civil administration shall be exercised by French citizens. The provisional government of de Gaulle was not recognized until October 1944. Imagine that Germany had survived the Second World War, unconquered but driven from occupied Europe, still a major world power under the regime that had conducted the war. How would these events in liberated France have been perceived? One can easily guess the figure of 7 million dead would no doubt have become gospel truth, much as Americans and Frenchmen now circulate figures with wild abandon about Indochina, as we shall see. And there would be no limits to the indignation over the barbarism tolerated, or the claim would be encouraged by the U.S. occupying forces that had conquered peaceful France, overthrowing its legitimate government virtually without French assistance. Similarly, we may imagine how an undefeated Japan might react to the spectacle of the annual reenactment of atomic bombing. For example, at a Texas air show in October 1977, with a B-29 flown by Paul Tibbets, the retired Air Force general who dropped the atom bomb on Hiroshima, before an admiring audience of 20,000. Perhaps the Germans, in our invented nightmare, would have proposed a reenactment of the second major atrocity that we recall from World War II, according to Justice Rowling. But Germany was defeated and occupied, so we are spared such venomous hypocrisy. But even defeated Germany provides some precedents. The Washington Post, April 10, 1977, featured a report from Dachau, which in its own way is reflective of West German attitudes toward the question of dealing with the Nazi era. There is, for example, no mention of the participation of German industry in the use of slave labor camp. It is a guilt never acknowledged here and rarely spoken about in our history books, says Barbie Distel, the Dachau Museum director. The general attitude is not to talk about, it is to forget about if it is possible, she adds, in reference to Dachau. But Germans, even though those directly implicated, are quick to concede error, perhaps even tragic error. Under interrogation in captivity, Goring said that liquidation of the Jews was a vast political blunder. Many would have made good nationalists and joined in the liquidation of the communists. If only Hitler had not been confused with these two issues, he said. And then there is the man known as the Hangman of Lions, twice sentenced to death in absentia by French courts for war crimes and now residing in peace in Bolivia, who concedes that mass killings of Jews constituted one grave error. Many of the SS officers believed that the Jews could have been put to better use, building roads to facilitate the advance of our troops. New York Times, May 18, 1975. Not all see error. For example, the chief legal officer of Lower Saxony, who resigned in March 1978 after the disclosure that in a 1936 doctoral dissertation, he had advocated that only a racially valuable person has the right to exist within the community. Someone who is useless for the community because of his inferiority or even harmful to it is to be eliminated. The law as a whole must serve racial development. But he felt neither morally nor politically obliged to quit. New York Times, March 25th, 1978. We leave to the reader the choice of appropriate current parallels. Like virtually all wars of imperial aggression, the war in Indochina was in part a civil war. Substantial Vietnamese forces fought with the French, and the U.S. invaders organized a large and well-equipped, though unwilling and demoralized army, as well as a network of terror organizations to assist them in destroying local resistance and maintaining the U.S.-imposed civil regime. Civil wars tend to be unusual in the cruelty they evoke. As a final precedent, let us consider a civil war that played a significant role in U.S. and world history, namely the American Revolution. For an example that was cited by Bernard Fall in reference to U.S. propaganda from outside intervention by Vietnamese in support of the South Vietnamese who were being massacred by the U.S. invaders in South Vietnam. The analogy is far from close. The American Revolution was minuscule in its comparison with the Vietnamese in the degree of force used by those opposed to the revolution and in the level of internal military and social conflicts that developed. The willingness of the British, both the British and rebel leaders, to accept, if not always enforce, a fairly humane convention of 18th century warfare served to mitigate some of the radical effects that civil war often have on society. And obviously the force levels were of vastly different orders of magnitude. In addition, the relative affluence of the American colonies significantly eased the impact of the war, although there was much suffering. Shai writes, revolutionary America may have been a middle-class society, happier and more prosperous than in any other time, but it contained a large and growing number of fairly poor people, and many of them did much of the actual fighting and suffering between 1775 and 1783. A very old story. Furthermore, one measurable effect of the war might have been to widen the gap between richer and poorer Americans. It is important to recall that the war remained a civil conflict in America after it had become a struggle between the United States and Great Britain and between France and Great Britain. In proportion to population, almost as many Americans were engaged in fighting other Americans during the Revolution as did so during the Civil War. The fact has seldom been given prominence, in part because so many of loyalists simply fled, expecting, as one said, that if the rebels should gain independence, that unfortunate land would be a scene of bloody discord and desolation for ages. Palmer suggests that, unlike France, the American counter of revolutionary refugees never returned, creating an illusion of tranquility and unity in the post-war republic. Van Doren summarizes the exodus as follows. There are no accurate figures as to how many persons, including women and children, left the United States on account of the loyalty to the British Empire, but it may have been as high as 100,000, of whom 35,000 may have gone from New York alone. The expulsion was so thorough that the next generation of Americans, with fewer former loyalists as reminders, almost forgot the civil aspects of the war and came to think of it as a war solely against England. The loyalists disappeared from American history, at least from ordinary knowledge of it, until the 20th century. Recall that the white population of the United States was then about 2.5 million, and that at least a fifth of the white population, 500,000 people, behaved in ways that enable us to identify them as loyalists. Comparative figures for South Vietnam would be about 4 million supporters of the United States and 800,000 refugees fleeing the victors. Comparative figures for all of Vietnam would double these numbers approximately. During the war, thousands of loyalists escaped with the British when they evacuated some area, most coming to live in New York in swarming desperation. Later, tens of thousands fled with the British, including ragged, unpaid American soldiers drifting down the Hudson Valley to sign on as sailors in the ships which were evacuating British forces. Genuine support for the war appears to have declined from 1775, Shai writes, as people grew wary of being bullied by local committees of safety, by corrupt deputy assistant commissaries of supply, and by bands of ragged strangers with guns in their hands calling themselves soldiers of the Revolution, and got angry when the British or Hessian or Tory troops misbehaved. The years from 1776 to 1782 might indeed be recounted as horror stories of terrorism, rapacity, mendacity, and cowardice, not to blame our ancestors for these things, but to remind us that a war fought by the weak must look alike. Both loyalists and rebels gave credit and currency to stories of inhuman deeds done by either to the other, and the loyalists argued that the American governments were more oppressive than the British had ever been. In particular, the British had frequently upheld the rights of the Indians against encroaching American settlers. One reason why many Indian tribes supported the British, as did many blacks, recognizing what lay ahead for them if the rebels proved victorious. In areas where British hardly appeared or not at all, Tories either ran away, kept quiet, even serving in the rebel armies, or occasionally took a brave but hopeless stand against revolutionary committees and gunmen. Meanwhile, at home, the British government attempted to justify a long, expensive war to an unhappy public on the ground that the king had a solemn commitment to defend his numerous American supporters against a rebel bloodbath. How familiar it all sounds. Some of the most graphic accounts of the nature of the civil conflict are found in letters of General Nathanael Greene, who command the Southern Continental Army from 1780 to 1783. Greene wrote, "The Whigs and Tories pursue one another with the most relentless fury, killing and destroying each other whenever they need. Indeed, a great part of the country is already laid waste and in utmost danger of becoming a desert. The great bodies of militia that have been in service this year employed against the enemy and in quelling the Tories have almost laid waste the country and so corrupted the principle of the people that they think of nothing but plundering one another. The country's full of little armed parties who follow their resentment with little less than savage fury. The South is still torn to pieces by little parties of disaffected who elude all search and conceal themselves to the thicket and swamps from the most diligent pursuit and issue forth from these hidden recesses, committing the most horrid murders and plunder, lay waste the country." Greene employed terrorism both to improve the morale of his supporters and to frighten the disaffected. He told his subordinate General Thomas Sumter that partisans were to strike terror into the enemies and give spirit to our friends. An example was a successful raid that Greene described to Thomas Jefferson as follows. They made a dreadful carnage of them. Upwards of 100 were killed, and most of them, the rest, cut to pieces. It had a very happy effect on those disaffected persons, of which there are too many in this country. But Greene also recognized that terror was a dubious tactic. In 1781, he outlined a new strategy to Sumter in the following terms: "Don't spare any pains to take off the Tories from the British interest, for though we have great reason to hate them, and vengeance would dictate one universal slaughter, yet when we consider how many of the good people must fall a sacrifice in doing it, we shall find it will be more for our interest to forgive than to persecute." This was also always my opinion, and if the war continues in this country, unless we can detach the people from British interests, we shall feel more inconveniences with them than all of the British army. Indeed, we do now. Loyalist sympathies were sufficiently strong so that British secret agent expressed his conviction that the British could raise a provincial army strong enough to defeat Washington, whose troops were not, as he represented, a respectable body of yeomanry, but a contemptible band of vagrants, deserters, and thieves, mainly Irish. The British did attempt Americanization of the war in the later stages, in part because of the unhappy public at home. The secret agent's judgment might have proven valid had it not been for the French intervention supporting the insurgency, what would now be called terrorist bands. As it was, New York alone furnished about 15,000 men to the British Army and Navy and over 8,000 loyalist militia. With the contribution of the other colonies, we may safely state that 50,000 soldiers, either regular or militia, were drawn into the service of Great Britain from her American sympathizers. During the war, the persecuted Tories had a sanctuary in New York to which they fled from every colony by boat, on foot, in carriage, or on horse, ready to thank God when they had passed the British lines and had been left behind them the din of persecution, including tarring and feathering, hoisting the victim upon liberty pole, forced oaths of loyalty, jailing for long periods without trial, confiscation of lands, and other forms of oppression and terror. Many were prevented from fleeing, others driven out. The records kept by the committees are of safety prone, beyond the possibility of doubt. The Tory charges that committee rule was despotic and tyrannous, while from the Tory pen we have a picture of an inexorable reign of terror. While few were actually killed, many were tried and sentenced. Washington noted in a letter that one or two have done what a great number ought to have done ago, commit suicide, referring to these miserable set of beings, those wretched creatures who retain their loyalty to the crown. Many fled abroad to await the outcome of the war, choosing to commit themselves to the mercy of the waves of tempestuous season rather than to meet the offending countrymen, as one Tory wrote. The largest fleet ever seen in America, more than 170 sail, departed in March, the most tempestuous month of the year, on the American coast, fearing that without a miracle the wretched fleet must be dispersed and lost. On their top-heavy decks were huddled a wretched throng of soldiers and refugees. It was important, though, one of them, that more events could concur to render the distress incomplete, and the ruins almost inevitable. Sir Henry Clinton wrote that Nothing distressed him so much as the applications he hourly received from great numbers of refugees who crowded to New York from every quarter of America. Many, he said, had been reduced from affluent circumstances to the utmost penury by their attachment to the king. As the British were withdrawn, most refugees fled, primarily to British American territories, including Nova Scotia, which one described as the most inhospitable clime that ever mortals set foot on. These women, delicately reared, cared for their infants beneath canvas tents, rendered habitable only by the banks of snow, which lay 6 feet deep, while strong and proud men wept like children and lay down their snowbound tents to die. But the boat people, quote unquote, were people perhaps more fortunate than those who remained. In violation of the treaty with the British and in spite of the recommendation of Congress, after the war, confiscation still went on actively. Governors of the state were urged to exchange the list of proscribed persons that no Tory might find a resting place in the United States. And in nearly every state, they were disenfranchised, while in many localities they were tarred and feathered, driven from their town, and warned never to return or sometimes murdered. One can imagine that a British Henry Camm would have made all of this. We also note that these aspects of the Revolutionary War are not early centerpieces of school textbooks describing the struggle of Americans for freedom from onerous foreign rule. We stress again that the analogy to Indochina, which will be obvious to any reader of the daily press, should not be drawn too closely. There are many crucial points of difference. The American rebels, as noted, were supported, indeed far outnumbered, by the military forces of France, while no foreign troops were engaged on the side of Vietnamese. The force brought to bear by the British and their local allies was infinitesimal as compared with Westmoreland's killing machine, and in fact the civil conflict inflamed by foreign aggression from 1946 was also naturally far more fierce given the nature of the intervention by France and the United States, and in the early stages Britain, which prepared the way for the return of French imperialism. Vietnam is far poorer than the American colonies, which were already ranked high among the more affluent societies in the world, and its foreign enemy vastly richer and more powerful, as well as incomparably more savage. Nor is there in Indochina anything comparable to the exploitation of blacks and persecution of Native Americans. Despite these and other crucial differences, it is nevertheless interesting to recall this example of a civil conflict enmeshed in a struggle for national independence and its consequences for the victims, loyalist blacks and Native Americans. To conclude, we note that it is standard in later scholarly work in American history to recount, in part at least, the torment of Native Americans and blacks at the hands of the victors in the revolutionary struggle, though it is equally common to describe this oppression, far from ended, as an unfortunate exception to the general humanism of the American experience. In a review of a book that is rooted in the familiar nationalistic strains of Daniel Borston's view of U.S. political history, Clarence Carrier makes the following apt comment. For the Irish who died building the railroads and canals in the East, the children who died in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, the women who died chained to their machines and factories, and Polish laborers burned to death in the steel mills of Gary, the Indians wasted by the Gatling gun of the West, or the slave who felt the white man's lash. Creeman enters the caveat that these were inexcusable omissions. When one might ask, do these inexcusable omissions cease to be omissions, and when do they become an organic part of American history? ? The point might be borne in mind, along with the historical background just recounted, when we turn to the questions of how the Indochinese people are facing their incomparably more severe problems, unrelated to anything in the U.S. experience, not only because of the destructive impact of colonialism and the absence of the immense natural advantages of the American colonists, but also because they have been subjected to murderous destruction, the likes of which the world has rarely seen on the part of those who now feel no shame when they let the words, quote unquote, human rights fall from their lips. Many other examples of a similar sort may be cited. The historical record serves as a kind of baseline against which we may evaluate events in post-war Indochina. To repeat, while Western propaganda attributes the suffering to the people of Indochina, those who flee the war or its aftermath, those who are persecuted within, and the vast majority who are attempting to reconstruct some sort of viable coexistence from the wreckage, to the evil effects of communist ideology or the generally uncivilized character of the third world, which has failed to our dismay to absorb Western humanism and honest historical analysis, would proceed quite differently. It would begin by establishing the common practice in comparable situations, then add an enormous increment attributable to the unusual barbarity of the U.S. attack with its legacy of destruction, bitterness, and hatred. Atrocities and oppression that exceed this measure might reasonably be attributed to Indochinese communism. Applying these standards to Vietnam, there seems little doubt that the aftermath of the revolutionary victory has been remarkably free of vengefulness. The same is true in Laos. No doubt Cambodia differs, even when one discounts the stream of falsification in Western propaganda. Finally, in evaluating these painful and troubled issues, we must bear in mind the long record of atrocity, fabrication, and the traditional gullibility of the intelligentsia regarding the alleged evil practices of enemies of their own state. So that's it. Just give me 1 second. I'll be right back with some closing remarks. I'll just review that chapter and closing remarks. We did 53 pages. Just 1 minute. Okay, so, excellent book, excellent book. I love to do these presentations because I think it's a great way to discuss the issues at hand. The chapter's title was Precedents. I wanted to make a few comments. I mean, the basic thing is, this was a warmonger, war criminal, racist, murderous, mafia gangsters of the U.S. government who conducted this, slaughter campaign in Indochina. We reviewed all of the different, the evil practices of the U.S. government. He had a little, a side thing with respect to the Nazis. He had a side thing with respect to the Nazis. But there's an important part of this. We talked about the Bryce Report, the British fabrication of Hun atrocities. Presumably the German atrocities against the people were fabricated. All of these atrocities that the Germans committed during World War I were fabricated by the British government and, used to, cause war criminal murders and, criminal murders by the British government of the regime, the Germans in World War I. In addition, there was one thing that, describes, basically the basic idea is the patriotic. Okay, so we have this is the part that I thought was very interesting. It is quite true that controversy rages over government policies and the errors or even crimes of the government officials and agencies. But the impression of internal dissidence is misleading. A more careful analysis shows that the controversy takes place, for the most part, within the narrow limits of a set of patriotic premises. This is quite tolerable indeed, a contribution to the propaganda system for the free press to denounce the government for its quote-unquote errors in attempting to defend South Vietnam from North Vietnamese aggression. And then we continue later to say that, if you don't accept these patriotic principles, the debate can rage. The more lively and vigorous it is, the better the propaganda system is served, since the propositions U.S. benevolence, lack of rational imperial goals, and defensive posture are more firmly established. But those who do not accept the fundamental principles of state propaganda are simply excluded from the debate, or if noticed, dismissed as emotional, irresponsible, etc. So that goes along a lot with, these presentations, these books that we read. There is not a patriotic premise in Dr. Chomsky's work, Dr. Knapp's work, all of these people, Dr. Black's work, all of these people write without patriotic premises. They look at the facts and they establish, a scholarly approach, a researcher's approach to evaluating data. Like if you get, all the numbers and then you just lie and fabricate more numbers to make it, go to your, hypothesis, then, you succeed. But that's called fraud. That's called racist fraud. And so I present my side of the story, which is my opinion, of course, but it is based on the facts of these well-researched and documented, historians and scholarly reviews. So if I come up with the conclusion without a patriotic premise, I do not use patriotic premises because that is fraud garbage. That is white fraud garbage, racist, warmonger, war criminal whites who use patriotic premises. And so because I use that, they would dismiss my statements as emotional, irrational, or irresponsible, etc. These are obviously wrong statements. Someone who does not accept patriotic premises, that's within their state lying system. It's the fraud white journalism of the United States and its Western propagandas. So, this is a very important thing to discuss, is that the U.S. system has a very small, narrow-minded debate. That debate is within the set of patriotic premises that the U.S. government requires for you to discuss things. If you don't discuss things in that scheme, that you are considered irresponsible or emotional, and they dismiss your, journalism as not, effective. Like my, YouTube videos would not be accepted by them, as they would consider it emotional or irresponsible. Those are the words that they would describe it. But the bottom line is that is just fraud. If you base it on patriotic premises, murder is murder. If you put patriotism into murder, you're calling murder, okay, right? Because murder can be racist motivated. It can be based on racist hate and, angry, white fascism. They can base it on white fascism and wanting to make, whites more powerful in America or more numerous in America. And so killing all the people that are non-whites, the Hispanics, the Africans, and the Asians. That is the basis for which I state that this, this statement exists. Putting it in patriotic premises is that, the essence of the fabrication system of the U.S. media, because it is based on a narrow set of patriotic premises. They don't have debates. They don't have open scholarly activity. Like we said yesterday in United States penetration of Brazil, there is no open democratic discussion. There is no open room for political debate because it is within this small, narrow-minded framework that you have to submit to patriotic premises. So murder is okay to, if you murder Asians, Hispanics, or blacks, right? That's the white racist, warmonger war criminals of the United States. That's their patriotic premise. And nobody should really submit to these sort of patriotic premises. So the second thing I wanted to just go over was, a comment I saw about the Japanese war criminals. So we saw basically that, the Japanese, he went over a good amount of Japanese war criminals, the Nazis. He basically spoke of, the murder of many of the Japanese war criminals. Let's get the page. The Nuremberg Tribunal was empowered to try and punish persons who, acting in the interests of European Axis countries, committed any of the following crimes. And, they talk about war crimes, the denazification procedure, the POWs. And then he went into Japan and he said none of the defendants in Tokyo was accused of having personally committed an atrocity. One Japanese general was executed on the sole grounds that he had failed to take adequate steps to secure the observance and prevent breaches of convention and laws of war in respect of prisoners of war and civilian internees. Basically he says that the U.S., basically based on the tribunal, 25 defendants in the Tokyo Tribunal were condemned to death by hanging. 2 died during the trial and 6 more died in prison. And Prime Minister Kanno committed suicide. Of the many procedural inadequacies of the tribunal, perhaps the most striking is that no neutral justices were appointed, let alone Japanese, but only representatives of countries allied against Japan, including the justice who was the survivor of the Bataan death marks. And acts committed by the anti-Japanese alliance were excluded from consideration of the tribunal. One of the Indian justice minister's pals described a dissent. What the conduct of the nations is taken account. When the conduct of the nations is taken account, the law will perhaps be found to be the only lost war is a crime. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was nothing that could be ever traced to the credit of the present accused. The people who were accused could not be, blamed for the Nagasaki Hiroshima bombing. And this from the Second World War, above all, two things are remembered: the German gas chambers and the American atomic bomb. So we forgot the American atomic bombs. The racist white warmonger war criminals of the United States. They serve jury and judge in foreign lands for war crimes when they are fascist, murderous frauds and fascist, murderous, racist American government frauds. And then finally, we talked about the war machine, the imperial aggression and the war machine. He compared it to the Revolutionary War and the war machine. And basically in the Revolutionary War, in Indochina, it was basically nobody was fighting for the Indochinese. These are racist American government, anti-Asian, anti-Indochinese, mafia, gangster, warmonger, war criminals. All of these people, based on the information in the chapter, should have been hanged for war crimes. Johnson, Nixon, Kissinger, Rusk, McNamara, Kennedy, Eisenhower, and John Foster Dulles. These people should have been hanged for war crimes based on the Nuremberg rules. They were not hanged because America is a criminal mafia group of white, gangsters. And that is why they walked free without any retribution. Not one war crime prosecuted by the United States, because it is a mafia state of gangster whites. And, I'm not a patriot. I don't express myself in a small scheme of patriotic premises. I speak the facts, and I speak based on factual statements. If you are a war criminal and a murderer, you go down for murder. If you are a murderer and you murder someone, no matter black, white, Hispanic, or Asian, you are a murderer and you should be prosecuted. The U.S. government ignores the crimes of murder by its whites, and that is the problem. It is a racist system of mafia, murderous, warmonger, war criminal gangsters. That's it. So basically, excellent book. Noam Chomsky, After the Cataclysm. We have the real page, which is Post-War Indochina and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology, the Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2. It's Noam Chomsky and Edward S. Herman. So let's finish up. 2 hours, 20 minutes. Sorry, it went a little longer, but it was a longer chapter. So tomorrow will be probably a little about the same. It'll be probably about the same. I might try to, cut it a little bit. So the book is available at the Google Drive link. Please download the PDF. It is a PDF book, and it will be available. We discuss the U.S. government warmonger war criminals in the book Post-War Indochina and the Reconstruction of Imperial Ideology, Political Economy of Human Rights, Volume 2. The United States government's actions in Indochina speak of unspeakable brutality, mass slaughter, the use of prohibited warfare technology, including white phosphorus, vomiting gases, mustard gas, and cluster bombs. Those bombs which release daughter bombs, which remain in the land far after the United States had withdrawn. In Dr. Chomsky's mind, the United States' action in Indochina was a criminal war of aggression by a superpower which unleashed unspeakable brutality and a military machine on a defenseless peasant population in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. He discusses at length the war criminals Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, Dean Rusk, Dwight Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles, John Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and Henry Kissinger, all of whom were responsible for the mass murder and genocide of the U.S. government from the years 1954 to 1975. Our first discussion is the U.S. impact on Indochina. The press fraud whites of the United States mass media, including the New York Times, James Reston, and Henry Pulitzer Prize-winning white frauds, Washington Post, Newsweek, and Reader's Digest, among many others who fabricated the extent of United States devastation of the land, claiming that the U.S. had been very cautious when it came to bombing the Indochinese people. Those fabrications were also followed by an attack on the Communist Party of Vietnam, who were trying to rebuild their land that had been devastated by the savagery of the United States government, automated murder machine of General Westmoreland. The U.S. warmongers were chasing oil in Indochina, and the history of Indochina includes plantation slavery by the racist whites of French colonial rule, who had kept the Indochinese people as plantation slaves from 1870 to 1946. Upon the completion of World War II, the French racist enslavers, backed by the American financial governments, Eisenhower and Dulles, tried to retake Indochina and fought a war with the Indochinese, who had proclaimed independence. The U.S. warmongers, after the French defeated Indochina, had offered France nuclear weapons, as John Foster Dulles told Premier Laniel, for unleashing devastation on Dien Bien Phu. The nuclear threat also included threats of nuclear attack on the Chinese mainland if China entered the war. It did not materialize, and the French lost the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and were ultimately defeated in Indochina in 1954. The United States warmongers could not accept the independence and sovereignty of Ho Chi Minh and his people, who had made gestures to President Wilson, a racist Ku Klux Klan and savage American white murderer, as well as President Franklin Roosevelt, who both refused the gestures and did not assist the Indochinese in their independence goals. Ultimately, the United States destroyed the international agreements, as the American warmonger mafia war criminals always do, and they threw out the Geneva Accords, the Paris Agreements, and even the Nuremberg trials, and waged a savage and brutal war against the Asians in Indochina. The U.S. government, capitalist white frauds, were trying to re-enslave the Indochinese people and take away their natural resources and steal the money of the native indigenous Indochinese. The U.S. oil-hungry mafia mass murders broke all international laws in this war and were condemned by the United Nations, the Geneva Accords, the Parisian elite, and the political French government, and numerous other countries. It is typical for the American government to flout international laws and its colonial enslavement of the Asian peoples, as they did in Indonesia, China, and Indochina. They enslaved the Chinese with a brutal dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek, who murdered over 1 million Chinese for American capitalism. He was a gangster and was proudly supported by Presidents Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower. The war was a racist war, as Chomsky states in his book, The Indochinese War. The Americans had racist tropes of Asian savages and criminal Asians who were low IQ and were lazy and incapable of self-government due to childlike attitudes. The U.S. government's murderous mafia gangsters hide their history and flout international norms for the sake of racist European prestige that they show the world due to all sorts of racist Oscar awards that they get for their murder campaigns across the world. So that's it. I'm glad you could join us, after the cataclysm, post-war Indochina and reconstruction of imperial ideology. Please attend tomorrow. We'll be talking about Vietnam. Glad you could join us today. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.